And the Supreme Court of Nigeria has just, of course, given its verdict in the two cases before it today. And that is, of course, involving the former Vice President of Nigeria, Atiku Abubakar, as well as the presidential candidate of the Labour Party. And what we can tell you categorically right now, breaking news, President Bola Tinubu has maintained his presidential seat, and Tinubu wins at the Supreme Court, with the court affirming his election victory. Now, there's going to be a lot of reactions, and we're going to spend the next several hours throughout the course of the day and, of course, into the weekend going through this verdict. Many of the justices simply just went straight to the point with their own judgment and said that the reasons and, of course, all of their leanings will be found out in their submissions that will be given out shortly. But President Bola Tinubu wins at Nigeria's Supreme Court, putting an end to contention, legal contention that might be over his victory. So that's what's coming in right now from Abuja. Our correspondent, Marvelous Obumanu, was outside earlier because, of course, because there were some restrictions on getting cameras and reporters into the courtroom. But then it was later on, as proceedings began, that we found out that, of course, there was some live feed. We'll be speaking to Marvelous in just a little bit. But a bit of this, of course, in regards to what the court was saying, what the panel was saying when it came to the conversations around the appeals that made their way. And one of the biggest contentions was the fact that the presidential candidates of the PDP, that is, of course, the People's Democratic Party, and a former vice president of Nigeria, Atiku Abubakar, had sought to introduce new evidence that had not been introduced at the tribunal level. And that evidence, of course, revolved around the president's time at Chicago State University. There were conversations and, of course, scandal and controversy over whether or not it was the president himself who attended and graduated from Chicago State University. In the past few weeks, there has been, many would say, an attempt to put that to bed, and it has, for many, been successfully put to bed, with CSU saying that, yes, it was President Bola Tinubu that attended and that graduated, but the conversation around potential forgery, alleged forgery of his certificate, how it went through a third party, the issues around his admission letter, and even whether or not there was something around the female, was he the one? Those have continued to trail the release from CSU of documentation, or at least accepting that it was President Tinubu that was at the Chicago State University. And that was part of what the evidence that the Atiku camp was attempting to introduce. Now, the Supreme Court dismissed Atiku's application to tender fresh evidence against the president on the grounds that the court lacked the jurisdiction to entertain such evidence that was not tendered before the lower court. Now, the Supreme Court rejected that. The 5-member panel, led by John Okoro, dismissed the application on the grounds that because it had not been tendered into evidence before the lower court, it was not something that the Supreme Court would be able to give account of. Now, Justice Okoro, in delivering the lead judgment on the appeal that Atiku filed to challenge the president's election, said that the appellant lawyers were tardy in their attempt to obtain the evidence and also tender it. And also, according to Justice Okoro, as of the time that Atiku brought the document, the trial presidential election petition court had lost jurisdiction to hear Atiku's petition challenging Tinubu's election. He also added that the Supreme Court did not have the power to accept and act on the evidence that the lower courts did not have nor acted on. So, of course, a lot of things are happening. You can hear from many of the justices a complete concurrence in their decisions. There seemed to be no minority or dissenting decision from any of the justices on the panel. Justice Okoro continued to wonder why former presidential candidates of the PDP, Atiku, sought to tender the fresh evidence when the grounds of his appeal had nothing to do with forgery against the president. And what he also said was that the jurisdiction of this court is donated to it by the Constitution. I quote, "One wonders what the appellant," that is, of course, referring to Atiku, "intends to do when none of the grounds of his appeal are hinged on forgery against the second respondent," and that is, of course, Mr. Tinubu. Now, the justice explained that Atiku's attempt to introduce the fresh evidence was aimed at reversing the gains made in speedy adjudication of electoral disputes that have been marred by prolonged hearings. Now, the Constitution of Nigeria covers timelines in regards to when parties involved in elections must submit their applications, as to when the tribunals must submit their own judgments, and even gives timelines beyond that if there's going to be an appeal, and of course the timeline for also the Supreme Court of Nigeria to also deal with. So there are a lot of issues that we will be rolling over in the coming hours. The court has also moved on from the Atiku appeal to the Obi appeal. Didn't take a lot of time in that appeal at all. All of the justices ruling that they were dismissing the case, that the appeal that the Obi party and the Labour Party had brought forth in terms of double nomination, dismissed, and saying that that particular appeal lacked merit. It was lacking in merit. So those are some of the issues that have come up right now. So those are some of the issues that have come up right now and that have, of course, been part of what the Supreme Court has done very quickly, quite different from when the tribunal ruled. That is, of course, the Presidential Election Petition Court. Very different from that. That was almost a 12-hour judgment that we covered right here at News Central, which kicked off around shortly after 10, the day, that very fateful day as it was, kicked off shortly after 10 and ran till about 10 that same day. So we also have a lawyer standing by who's going to join us. We'll also be looking to speak to Marvelous Abumuna, our correspondent in Abuja, who is outside the Supreme Court, to give us updates. We'll be seeing if we can get some responses, if any of the parties are also right now holding